How we doing? Good morning. Okay, great. That's awesome. My name is Josh, and I'm one of the pastors here at the Vineyard, and very excited you guys are here with us. We know during the Christmas season, lots of stuff you guys could be doing, and very grateful that you're here today, hopefully to experience Jesus and to encounter his kingdom, and maybe meet some awesome people here at the Vineyard. So really, really pumped that you guys are here. We are continuing our series, Storyteller series. We're kind of intertwining a little bit of Christmassy stuff as we gear up for Christmas Eve services. But today, we're just going to be continuing talking about parables of Jesus, that little stories that Jesus told about how to follow him. What does it look like to learn more about him in these distinct little stories? We've been going through this for the last 6 or 7 weeks now. And today, we're going to be in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14. So if you have your Bible, go on ahead and flip on over Luke chapter 14. If you don't have a Bible, scripture references will be on the screens all around me, or you can use your phone or whatever it might be. But we are going to be in a little section of parables that most scholars would say this is kind of like a summary section of parables. There's 3 distinct parables, and it talks about the cost of following Jesus, the weight of being a follower of Jesus. The context is very specific. A whole bunch of people have been following him. Crowds start showing up they're inspired by Jesus, and Jesus confronts the fact that a whole bunch of people have decided with the potential mindset to think that following Jesus might be easy, that it might just come with a lot of benefits. And so he's going to challenge that today, and we'll get into that in just a second. But to kind of help us ground ourselves in understanding people's perspectives of following Jesus and what that looks like, a little story for you. So 12 years ago, this month actually, maybe even 13 years ago, maybe getting my dates wrong. I was 22 years old, Christmas season, madly in love with this gal named Brienne Green, who's now my wife. But at the time, Brienne Green, the most amazing girl I've ever met in my entire life. We had been dating for 6 months. I finally wooed her into a relationship. I asked her to date me 9 times. She rejected me 8 times. Over the course of a year, it was horrible, but I caught her, and I was like, I need to marry this girl, or else she's gonna leave. I gotta seal this deal, so to speak. So over the Christmas season, I was like, all right, I'm going to propose to her. And luckily enough, Brienne, if you guys did not know this, she has a twin sister. They're virtually identical. And so I kind of had a sweet, awesome cheat code when it came to looking for a ring, in that I could bring her twin sister. One, because they both have the same hand size, so I was able to literally just pair up rings and stuff like that. But also, I was able to double dip and get the approval of the twin, which is very important in twin relationships. You just got to, if they don't like you, it's over, right? So Christmas season comes around. I've saved up as much as I possibly can. I'm a super poor college student, got all the student loans, but I've got a budget to buy a ring. And I know what Brienne wants. She's told me that 1,000 times, the exact shape of the ring, and she even declared what size diamond she wanted. And I was like, there is no way that this 22-year-old college kid could buy what you want, but I'll try. I'll try my best. So I went shopping for this wedding ring, and went to a bunch of different places with my sister-in-law. Amazing time, and we're going to all the typical places that you go. In Colorado, it was like Jared's, and there was a couple of other, well-known, famous jewelry stores that you'd go look at wedding rings, and everybody's throwing their big quote-unquote sale, right? They just mark it up just to mark it back down again. They're not actually, did you guys know actually in Black Friday, did you know that a bunch of companies got busted for fake, they're falsifying their discounts? They literally just put the same price but said Black Friday, and everybody's like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So I'm going to all these jewelry stores with my future sister-in-law, looking at all these rings, and I'm like, okay, these are pretty good. We're thinking about different stuff like this, and I was like, you know what? There's one more place I really want to go to, though. And it was, just down in downtown Denver, and it was known for being kind of like a family-owned, smaller jewelry store. But the difference between them and your kind of larger places is that they had kind of signs all over the place and when you got in, the whole thing was that you didn't haggle for anything there. Has anybody ever went jewelry shopping and then the whole deal is you have to you have to like do a thing with the person. You're like, no, I won't pay $1,000. I'll pay 800. And they're like, well, see ya. And you're like, bye-bye. And then like, they're like, no, please don't. It's like it's a weird thing. Like used car dealership, same thing, right? Well, this jewelry store, I don't know, whatever you call it. So this place marketed itself as, hey, we don't do that. The price is the price. What we have is kind of universally accepted as the best price. They go by weights and clarity. None of their employees work on commission at all, and so they were all salaried, and so there was no real agenda for them to upsell anything. It was just, if you like it, then you pay for it. So I walk in, and I'm like, this is a really cool concept. I don't really like to haggle, and it was getting awkward because I kept doing it in front of my sister-in-law, and she was like, Josh, stop. This is really weird. And so walk in, and we see the rings, and I think the concept is great until I see the ring, like the one that I knew that Brienne wanted. It was perfect. It was everything. It fit Bethany's hand. I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Like it looked great. And she was like, her sister was like, this is perfect for Brienne. And I was like, this is so perfect for Brienne. The problem though is that it's like $500 out of my budget. Like I don't have the money to pay for this, and I was already super in debt with student loans. So I was like, I'm not taking out a loan to buy this wedding ring, but I don't have the budget for it, and this is basically like it. And I'm looking at the guy who owns the shop, and he's like this old man, like late 80s. He's from New York, so he's just, he's got that look, right? The hardened, like I've been on a subway my whole life look, and he's just, ugh. But he was very kind, but he was stern, and I kept looking at him. I was like, hey, bro, I know that like you have signs everywhere in this entire shop that say don't haggle, but... And I began to plead with this man. I was like, bro, come on, just like $100 off. I was like, bro, my wife, she won't even say yes if I don't get this ring for her. Like, are you gonna sabotage my marriage and my future children because of this price? And the guy's like, dude, the price is, like, what are you talking about? And I got so desperate because I wanted the ring so bad, and I knew it was costly. I knew it was worth it. I actually went on eBay while I was standing in front of this hardened New Yorker, and I went, well, hey, bro, look at this. Look at the price of that ring on eBay. And he was like, that's a fake ring. Like, that's made of plastic. What do you do? And it was absolutely pathetic. So finally, my sister-in-law leaves the jewelry shop, and she's getting super awkward. She's like, you're not allowed to do this here. And the guy just looks at me, and he goes, okay, here's the deal, bud. He's like, I get what you're doing, but read the situation. The cost is the cost. And you're either going to pay for it because of its beauty and because of its quality, or you're going to walk out. And I just looked at him, and I was like, oh. Now, I tell you that story. I ended up buying the ring, so we figured it out. I ended up budgeting for it and made it work. But I tell you that story because I think a lot of us, even when we know the quality of something is worth the cost, there's something in us that we either, if you're a bargain shopper, if you're a coupon person, you kind of get this. But I think innate with all of us is we always want to see just how much we can get off something. We can always reduce the price a little bit. We always wonder, is there a knockoff or is there an option to really make this thing work for me? I think it's just a natural disposition we have, especially in the Christmas season. A lot of us, that we have this disposition because we want to buy as much as we can to take care of our families or whatever it might be. But unfortunately, a lot of us approach a relationship with God. If you have a relationship with Jesus, we approach Jesus with this same kind of mentality. That we come to him expecting or assuming that following him, having a relationship with him, should come with some sort of discounts. That we have the ability to bargain a little bit. Maybe we don't give as much of our life away as we think we're required to, or we think that his expectations are not as high as they are. And so we kind of get into this interesting bartering situation, and we think that Jesus is willing to give a little bit because he's got margin when it comes to us following him. I think a lot of us have this perspective. We try to negotiate, we try to determine, we try to falsify different things, and what Jesus is going to tell us today through these parables is that that's not how it works. Following Jesus is the price. It's the listed price. It is what it is. There is no negotiation. There is no you determining the value because the value is infinitely worth it. It's eternally worth it, and it's just priced at what it is. And so today, we're going to see Jesus tell that to a group of people, potentially thousands of people as these crowds are following Jesus. And he's going to list off three specific ways that following him costs a lot, that there's no negotiation to it. And so here's how we're going to work this, kind of weave this in and through. It's a little bit different than some of my sermons I've done before. So because there's three distinct parables in Luke chapter 14, what we're going to do is I'm going to share the kind of main point of each parable. So I'll do the parable main point. Then we'll look at the passage of what Jesus is referencing to, and then we're going to apply it, and then we'll do that just like 3 times over. So we'll do the point, the passage, and then the application, and you'll see that Jesus actually increases the level of what it costs to follow him every single time he tells a parable. And the reason why he's doing that is because he's trying to siphon us down. He's trying to distill following him down to something very difficult, but very worth it if we're willing to follow him. If we're willing to actually do this. So, does that make sense? Yeah, cost of discipleship, 3 ways. We'll jump right into this. We got a little bit of time here, so let's have some fun. Let's start with the very first parable, and the main point here is Jesus says that following Jesus, costs radical devotion. It costs radical devotion, and some scholars actually say radical adoration would be another way to describe this. So let's look at chapter 14, verses 25 through 27. This is just the first little parable that we're given here, or parabolic teaching. So verse 25, we get the context. Luke says, the large crowds were traveling with Jesus. So there's a whole bunch of people following him. He's becoming very famous, and people are becoming interested in the idea of following him, but they don't actually know the cost of following him. They're like me when I went jewelry shopping, but I wasn't yet in love with the ring. So there's this large crowd following, and then Jesus turns to the large crowd, and this is what he says to him. He says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple, my follower. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. So we'll stop there. Jesus just said something pretty insane, right? Got a whole crowd following him, and all of a sudden he turns around and he goes, here's the deal. If you're going to follow me, the cost is your affections, your adoration, your love, your allegiance. It's literally everything. And he goes on to describe this pretty insane situation, especially in the first century in a Jewish context where family was everything. This is, actually, if you're from Eastern culture, this actually makes sense because your culture is a lot more similar to the Middle Eastern culture in the first century than American culture today. American culture, we really don't care about family that much, which is really sad. But Jesus goes to this culture that literally had intergenerational living situations. Parents were living with their grandchildren. If you needed to be taken care of, you got taken care of by your immediate family. And Jesus says to them that if you're going to follow me, your love for me has to be so extravagant that in comparison to your love for your family, it needs to appear as if you hate them. Now, the silence that you just heard would have been 10 times worse in that culture. Jesus just said, if you're going to love me, it needs to look like you hate them. If you're going to follow me, you need to hate yourself, hate your children, this is pretty insane. Now, there's other translations of the New Testament that will modify the language a bit because Jesus isn't actually saying you're supposed to hate your family. He's being hyperbolic. He's trying to make it a ridiculous point because we know that Jesus perfectly followed the law, and literally in the 10 Commandments, it says to honor your father and your mother. So we know that Jesus is not about dishonoring your parents or dishonoring your children or dishonoring the people that you love the most. Jesus is not in the business of making sure you actively hate people, but he's in a hyperbole, he's trying to create this radical chasm of your perceived love for things. And so he gets at this idea of, he's saying, hey, here's the deal. If you're going to start following me, literally, these people have been actually walking in Jesus' footsteps. Where he goes, they go. What he says, they try to do. And he says, if you're going to start doing this thing, then your love for me needs to be so radical and so almost foolish that it looks like nothing else matters. It looks like no one else matters. Now, that's a high cost if you think about that, guys, right? Like, imagine if your spouse came up to you and said, I am so sick and tired of your love for Jesus, it feels like you don't even love me. According to Jesus, that actually technically wouldn't be bad. Now, if you're loving Jesus and seriously neglecting your spouse or your children, then that's not what Jesus is getting at, but there needs to be a comparative component to it. You love him so much. So I'm going to tell you a little give you an example of what this is actually kind of supposed to look like, because it's like fleshed out in real life. It makes a little bit more sense. So forgive me if you are not a sports fan. I recognize every single time a pastor preaches on sports, and most people don't like sports, they're like, oh my gosh, give me a better analogy. But this is the best I got. So I am from Denver, born and raised. I love the Denver Broncos. If you don't know who the Denver Broncos are, they're a football team. They're very fun to watch when they're winning. And honestly, I grew up 90s, 2000s, and so I was around for every single one of their Super Bowls, which if you don't know what a Super Bowl is, it's a very, very, very important game, and they win a big trophy. It's a big deal. So I've been around, for all of their Super Bowls, and I love them. My allegiance is to them. I care about them. I spend my Sunday afternoons watching them. Well, there's another team that's close in what's called our division, and they're from here. They're actually originally, from San Diego, but they're the Los Angeles Chargers. And they're a team that we play against twice a year. And honestly, to just be kind of like candid with you, I really don't care about the Chargers. Like, they're not a team I actively despise, mainly because they're kind of like the little brother who's never done anything. Like, they don't win. There's like, they're whatever, right? And half of you in Los Angeles, you don't even care about them because you root for the Rams or nobody, right? You don't really think about it. But I have family from San Diego who were obsessed with the Chargers. And so what's going to happen this week is on Thursday evening, the Denver Broncos and the Los Angeles Chargers are playing each other at SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, okay? Now, if I go, which I don't know, we're hopefully going to be able to buy some cheap, nosebleed seats, and maybe we can go with some of our family. Here's the deal. Probably not you, Asher. I love you, but it's just your mom and I. So if we go, here's what's going to be fascinating. If we go and we go with our family, and I go with my cousins because they're Chargers fans, if I show up, the moment that the team I love is playing a team that I don't like, my love for that team is going to appear as if I hate that other team. I'm going to scream and shout and yell and rejoice in all things Broncos, and I will boo and yell and scream and just treat the opposition and even my own family as if I do not want to be around them because they represent something I do not want to be represented by. This is how sports works. It brings out our allegiance. We get super amped about these things. We get excited about things. Our allegiance heads towards something, and if someone in that moment were to see me, they'd go, wow, Josh really hates the Chargers. And I would say to them, I don't actually hate the Chargers. I just love the Broncos. Do you guys hear what I'm saying? This is how our relationship with Jesus is supposed to look when it comes to the rest of our relationships. If you're going to follow Jesus, there is no such thing as just being love struck. There is no such thing as flirting with Jesus. There is no such thing as temporarily finding him attractive and then moving on. You love him so much to the point where if someone were to evaluate your love for him compared to your love for your family, it would appear as if you hate your family. It's challenging, but this is what Jesus' call is. This is the cost. your affections are for him. Your love is for him. Your adoration is for him. When he says go, you go. When he says stop, you stop. You stop living certain ways. You stop thinking certain ways. You stop engaging in certain activities. You stop. When he says worship, you worship. When he says leave everything, you leave everything, because your entire heart is given to him. So a question that you should ask this Christmas season, it's an amazing season to ask this, guys, because everything in our culture is begging for your affection right now and your love and your adoration. Timothy Keller actually talks about this as the world is crying out for you to worship their idols. The world wants you to bow down and give your heart to the idol of Apple, the idol of Amazon, the idol of Tesla, the idol of political whatever. In a world where everything is craving your affections, are you going to push all of that to the side and say, I want and I love Jesus? That's the cost. And you have to evaluate that. You have to discipline yourself to say, is this worth it for me? It's a good question to ask. I'm not expecting you to answer that right now, but I think that if you're sitting there thinking, I don't actually think I love Jesus that much, then that should convict you and compel you to go, wait a second, why? Why do I not love Jesus with everything? Why do I feel like it's not worth it? So that's the first thing that Jesus says. Following him costs radical devotion, radical adoration. Above all other things, even to the disappointment of your family, your friends, your children, you love Jesus wholeheartedly. The second thing we see Jesus say here is that following him costs lifelong obedience. Not temporary obedience, not seasonal obedience, but lifelong obedience. Look at verses 28 through 30. We get into a second parable that he shares with us. 28 through 30, he says, suppose that one of you wants to build a tower. I don't know if any of you want to build a tower. Think about building a home or an ADU or building something, I don't know, whatever you can put your mind to and think like, I would like to build that. It requires something. He says, suppose one of you wants to do that. Won't you first sit down, estimate the cost, to see if you have enough money to complete it? Like, you're not just going to start a job. You're not just going to start an endeavor without evaluating what's in your bank account, what's your income, what's your expenditures. Why would you start something that would be very well known, a tower, something very structurally like, wow, some people are going to see it, without evaluating? That doesn't make any sense. And he says, for if you lay the foundation of the tower, but you're not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. So this is the second parable that Jesus tells us, or tells the crowd, about following him. Following Jesus costs lifelong obedience. So he presents this crowd, or us, with the parable about making plans. And he describes that there is a level by which, and he's comparing making plans or building something to following him. That's, again, the context here. And what he says is very challenging to our culture, and in particular, Western American Christian culture. It's this idea where Jesus is basically saying, following him is not really about a singular decision. You guys notice how he's saying that? He's saying, if you want to follow me, that sounds really good in theory. You can start taking steps to follow me. He says, but here's what really following me is really like. It's like building something that takes a long time. And you have to sit down and evaluate, is it worth it? Do I have the money for this? Do I have the time? Do I have the energy? Because if you don't, you're going to pour a foundation, and then you're going to put some 2x4s on the foundation, and you're not going to actually build, and everybody is going to see it. So what he's actually poking at is this idea that following him is not just one moment in your life. And I don't want to step on too many toes here, guys, but like following Jesus is not showing up to church one Sunday, raising your hand, saying, yes, I follow Jesus, and then you're good. That's not how Jesus operates. He does not have this idea that you just make a decision and you're good for eternity and everything is great and you go live your life. He has a very high expectation that if you say yes to him, you are saying yes for a lifetime. This is why he calls us, the church, his bride. And he marries his bride because the idea is that you're covenanted to Jesus. You make a lifelong commitment to him that should never be broken, which means that you're not saying yes to a date with Jesus. You're saying yes to being married. Now, in our culture, in California, you can get divorced for whatever reason, which is a really sad thing that's come out of our culture. So we kind of have a weird view that marriage is easily, you can kind of end it and move on. That's not how we're supposed to interpret marriage. This is supposed to be a serious, lifelong commitment, barring the worst atrocities of all time. You're together. And Jesus goes, this is what it's going to cost you if you're going to follow me. This is not just a decision. It takes lifelong obedience where at the end of the day, what you've built is this immaculate tower of faith. And it's not perfect, but it was done well. You calculated it. You thought diligently about it. You processed the implications of it. I mean, every time I meet with someone who's not a Christian and they're kind of on that progress towards becoming a Christian, they're in that like sequential process of working through their doubts, and then they get to a point where they're just more or less questioning whether or not it's really just even worth it. Most of the time, I'll describe to them what it's going to cost them. It usually costs them their friends, costs them their families. It costs them, in all likelihood, their status in their job. And then they start really going, wait a second, is this really going to be worth it? And I tell them all the time, I say, it's absolutely worth it, but you may not think it's worth it in the moment. So you have to evaluate that. Are you signing up for something that will be polarizing? Are you willing to do that? And there's a big evaluative process that comes into play. And actually, what's so sad in American Christianity is that we've actually made that decision-making process, that discerning process, we've actually kind of pushed that to the side and acted like that's a bad thing. Like someone who's like curious but not ready to make a commitment is actually the most godly thing that can happen for someone. Like if someone walks in the room today and says, I want to accept Jesus, my first thing is, are you sure? But in most churches, they go, whoa, no, don't ask that. It's like, no. They should doubt. They should seriously question if following him is worth it because he says, take up my cross, die, lose yourself that you may gain eternal life. There's a cost there. And so we have to ask ourselves, is it really worth the long-term obedience that Jesus demands of us? I think that in my generation, this is a huge one. There's this whole idea like, have you guys ever heard of the song, I Have Decided to Follow Jesus? It's like an old hymn, right? I have decided to follow Jesus. I can't sing, so work with me here. But like, it's a great song. The context of that song is pretty profound. An Indian missionary goes to India, tries to preach the gospel, and then gets murdered for their faith. But before they do, they write this hymn, and it gets turned into a beautiful song that gets added to in different verses and choruses. But that song, if you only sing the first 3 lines of the verse, which is just, I have decided to follow Jesus 3 times. I have decided, follow Jesus. I have decided, follow Jesus. I have decided, follow Jesus. No, don't sing it. Don't sing it. How weird would it be if we never sang that 4th line? Shannon, music teacher, it'd be weird. One, it's sitting on like a dissonant note, so it doesn't make any sense. Secondly, the 4th line surmises the entire verse. No turning back, no turning back. Which means that the author who was willing to die for their faith recognized that it is not just, I decided to follow Jesus, but it's I decided to follow Jesus, and there is absolutely no turning back. But we often push that other line of the verse aside in our personal lives, and we go, I have decided. And it's like, no, it's going to cost you everything. So is it worth it? We have to think about the long-term implications of following Jesus, friends. The long-term implications of what it means to say, I'm not following back. Are you willing to follow him forever? Are you willing to listen to him forever? Are you willing to attempt to be faithful forever? Are you willing, when it is miserable to follow him, are you willing to do it? That is what Jesus says is the cost. Lifelong obedience. Oh, that's hard, right? In the culture we live in today, seeing how many Christians continue to fail over and over again in this lifelong obedience. This is hard, but this is what Jesus says. Not when it is an easy decision, but when it costs us everything. That's what it requires to follow Jesus. And number 3, this is the third parable. Jesus says following him costs you what is perceived as a regular life. It costs you a regular life. Luke chapter 14, verses 31 through 33. This is a fascinating parable. This is what Jesus says. He says, or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off, and he will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. And then he goes on to talk about salt losing its saltiness. It can't be buried. The whole idea is basically that this is very costly. It requires a lot. But he tells this parable, and if you actually think about what he's saying in this parable about the 2 kings, this is very, very, very outlandish. If you guys look at the very first section of the verses again, Jared, if you want to go back into verse 31 and 32. Suppose a king goes to the war against another king. Won't he first down consider whether he has his 10,000 men can go against 20,000? Now think about that from a military perspective. There should be no king in the first century who considered their odds good if they were outmanned 2-1. That's illogical. If you were a council member to a king or a military leader to a king, and you came to the king and said, King, there's 20,000 people over the bend, and we got 10,000, but I really think we can do this, you'd be considered a lunatic. The math doesn't make sense. Unless somehow some supernatural intervention takes place, the odds are against you in every single way. And Jesus actually says in this very outlandish way, he goes, hey, this is what it's like. This ridiculous story that I'm telling you, which is follow me, and it cost you 10,000 men versus 20,000 men, he's more or less saying, here's the deal. You look at that situation, it doesn't make any sense. You can apply for peace, and hopefully there'll be peace in the situation. But then he adds this really strange little phrase at the end. He says, those who don't give up everything cannot be my disciples, which basically means that if you're the king and you have the 10,000 and you ask for peace for those who have the 20,000, then implications of that is Jesus is saying that person is actually not his disciple because they're not willing to lose everything. So Jesus is saying something really annoying, which is if you have any semblance of thinking that following him is going to make logical sense in your life, that it's going to bring normalcy to your life, that you're going to walk into situations and the math is going to be right, and you're going to be able to fight this thing off, do this thing well, live this way a certain way, hope that things go appropriately, you're totally misconstruing how following Jesus is going to look. It doesn't make any sense to follow him, is what he's trying to say. It doesn't make logical sense. I mean, it makes logical sense if we're talking about empirical data and following him and his resurrection and his authenticity as a son of God. But he's saying that the life that he commands you to live will look anything but regular. It will be full of illogical, from the world's perspective, decisions that you make. It will be costly. It will make, when you calculate everything, you'll go, wait a second, I only have 10,000 and they have 20,000. What am I doing right now? And in that moment, you say, no, I decided to follow Jesus. The cost is everything. And so this idea that you can have a regular life and follow Jesus, Jesus says, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Now, it's not shocking at all that after Jesus says all this stuff in this chapter and then the subsequent chapter, a lot of people stop following him. And in only a couple chapters from now, he ends up getting arrested, betrayed, and put on a cross. And the same people who are following him end up becoming the same people who say, crucify him. It's because when Jesus starts saying stuff like this, which is following him requires your adoration, your devotion, your regular life. Following him requires all of your obedience forever. People start realizing, oh no, that is not what I signed up for. I signed up for a God who would tell me that I am amazing, that he loves me, and that everything is going to be okay. And instead, this guy is telling me that he's amazing, he is victorious, nothing is going to be okay, but that's okay. Oh, that's very hard. I mean, because think about this. They're following this magician in their minds. And in a year, he gets slaughtered on a cross. What objective failure that is. But then all of a sudden, he's risen from the grave. It makes no sense at all, and yet that is the life that Jesus says we are to live. We lose the regularity. We lose the simplicity. If we want to follow Jesus, we have to go against all odds. Any semblance of normalcy needs to be gone. And how this looks from a Christian perspective is very simple. You end up becoming someone who gives more than you ever thought possible in every way. You give your life to people. You give your love to people. You give your money away. You give your time away. You become a self-sacrificing lover of others because that's what Jesus did. It makes no sense, but you do it. You will become someone who sacrifices more than you can ever handle. You will be a person who has to make decisions on your faith versus your family. You will be betrayed. You will be ruined. That is an inevitable reality of following Jesus. You will be heartbroken. You will feel undone. You will feel destroyed. And yet, paradoxically, you will gain everything because Jesus endured all of that for you and sympathizes with you and is with you. That is the cost of following Jesus. This is what Jesus says. Radical devotion, lifelong obedience, and regular life. So very simply, we just need to ask ourselves, is it actually worth it? That's what I want you to ask today. Is it worth it? And some of you might think, I don't even think this is possible for me. And I want to share just a very quick story of a very regular person who now she's not regular anymore in most people's eyes. Her name is Jackie Pullinger. But her story is phenomenal. She was in the 1960s. She was 16 years old. This dainty little girl falls in love with Jesus. She's in the middle of a house that's pretty nominal Christian at best. Becomes a follower of Jesus and decides, I'm going to give my whole life to him. I don't know how, but I am. And then in her 20s, she has $10. She gets on a boat, and she feels like God says to her, you need to get on this boat, and then I'll tell you when to get off. So she's 22 years old, gets off she gets to Hong Kong. Mind you, she's a 22-year-old single woman who doesn't really think that she's supposed to even do much. I mean, she believes that God's asked her to do something crazy, but she doesn't even know what kind of status she has, and she's a woman in a culture that wasn't really pro-women, or in a world that wasn't pro-women, and so there's all these difficult things, and she feels like God tells her, get off the boat when she gets to Hong Kong. So she gets off the boat, she goes to the walled city, which is like in the 60s, it was still to this day, but in the 60s, the most drug-infested, ridiculous prostitution, the most decrepit situation you could possibly imagine. And over the course of, until today, she's literally still doing missions work in China today. Over the course of decades, she sees unbelievable revival take place. And in the midst of this entire story, there's countless moments where she's almost beaten to death. Countless moments where she's trying to witness to a drug addict, praying that God would somehow relieve this person of their heroin addiction. Somehow they'd be filled with the Spirit of God. That she lost all of her money. There were gangs that would come after her because she was literally helping people get out of their addiction, which meant that the gangs that were selling the drugs weren't actually in favor of it. And mind you, this is a 22-year-old girl in the 60s, and she does this. And she has a famous quote, and one of her one of the interviews that she does, she doesn't like to do interviews at all. If you try to contact her, literally you'll just get an old missionary woman saying, no, thank you. You can come and visit and serve, but she doesn't do interviews. But in one famous interview, somebody asked her, they said, why? Why would you do this? Weren't you afraid to die? You're 22 years old, you're going to Hong Kong. This is gang-ridden violence that's going to kill you. What on earth were you thinking? And this was a famous quote that she has. She says, I left and I wasn't afraid to die, but instead I was afraid of not obeying God. Do you guys grasp what she said? She goes to a place as a 22-year-old where death seemed inevitable, and she goes, I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of disobeying. I'm afraid of saying yes to Jesus, but then not actually following through on my yes. It drove her to do something ridiculous, insane, something that everybody would think is wildly inappropriate for someone her age, someone of her status, someone of her gender. And yet she went. And I think that she is an amazing example to all of us that every single one of us is called to say yes and to follow. Count the cost, evaluate your devotion and your adoration. Determine if you are willing to give your life, your entire life to Jesus, and be willing to lay on the altar all that you think is a regular life so that way you could say, I follow you, Jesus. This is the call, friends. And so as we respond and worship today, I just want you to start thinking about that. Am I willing to do this? Am I really, really, really willing to do this? All of our songs will kind of help guide you on that journey and think through that, and the communion elements and all that stuff will help you get there. But just think, is it worth the cost to follow Jesus? So let me pray for us, and then we'll worship and we'll respond. So Jesus, we want to acknowledge that following you is not easy, and I think a lot of us wish it was easy. I wish it was easy a lot of times, but we recognize that what you're saying in this passage is very specific. It's very particular. Following you is hard. It's challenging. And so I pray this morning that we would feel the weight of that in the service we would feel the expectancy of that there would just be a lot there. So yeah, would you just help us discern this morning, Jesus? And help us to think through this diligently, and help us to not make an unwise decision or a fickle decision. So we love you, and we pray these things in your name. Amen.